There are two versions of the Beijing summit. One was on camera, one was on the agenda. The version on camera had the handshake, the ceremonial table, a delegation of American executives whose combined market capitalization is larger than the GDP of most countries on Earth. The version on the agenda had 3 named oil flows, 1 undelivered protocol, and a single sentence about Taiwan that had never been said out loud at this level before. You were shown one of them on the news this week. Tonight we look at both, and at the ladder this meeting just moved everyone 1 rung up. This video is about the gap between the public picture and the working machinery. That is what this channel does, not predict, not cheerlead, read. The rule for tonight is simple, and it applies to everyone on the table. We judge each side by its own stated doctrine, not by ours. If a leader walks in with a published strategy and walks out short of it, that is a fact about their strategy, not a verdict from us. First call, single word. Type version 1 in the comments if you bought the televised summit. Type version 2 if you suspected the agenda was different. 1 word. We are going to need that number by the end. And 1 reframe, because every word in this analysis has to mean what it actually means. A summit is not an event. A summit is a settlement attempt under a deadline. 2 leaders walked into Beijing under their own clocks, and both clocks were running. Trump went into Beijing with a strategy his own team had published in pieces over the past year. The image that fits it cleanest comes from Imperial China itself. In the old empire, when a governor lost the emperor's confidence, a silk cord arrived at his door. It was not a threat, it was an instruction. The governor was expected to use it on himself, quietly, and the matter was closed. The silk cord in 2026 was not silk, it was oil. The plan was to wrap free flows around the Chinese economy and tighten until Beijing accepted 3 specific changes. Cut the industrial throughput, freeze the Petro-Yuan project before it could compete with the dollar in oil pricing. Walk back the continental footprint, the ports, the railways, the loan books on 3 other continents. That was the deferred condition, what the cord was for once it was around the neck. Free flows in the cord. Venezuela was the auxiliary strand. Iran and Russia were the load-bearing ones. Without the load-bearing strands, the cord doesn't tighten, it just sits on the desk. That is leverage diplomacy. Walking into Beijing without those strands is presence diplomacy. The summit was supposed to be the first, it became the second. Before anything else, name the win. The auxiliary prong moved. Maduro's regime is materially weaker than it was 12 months ago. Fewer revenue channels, fewer regional cover stories, a shrunken external lifeline. Whatever the administration's columns look like on the morning of the trip, Venezuela is in the win column, and it belongs there. I watched the regional pressure sequence twice before this draft. On the first pass, it looked opportunistic, hit-driven. On the second pass, the order of operations was visible. Financial pressure, then a regional partner alignment, then the political squeeze. It was a real campaign, it worked. The calibration line is the one no campaign team wants to put on the slide. Auxiliary moves don't substitute for main ones. A win on the sidecar doesn't reroute the train. Venezuela was a win. It was not the win the cord needed. Now the 2 strands that mattered. Iran and what got nicknamed in the briefings as the Anchorage spirit, the August Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska, which was meant to produce at least an outline on the Ukraine track that could be carried forward to Beijing in November. That outline never made it onto paper. Start with Iran. The bar Trump's own team set was modest by the standards of his first term. A deal, even a thin one, even one signed sheet that could be waved on the lawn. A protocol in the most literal sense, paper, signatures, a date. By the time Air Force One pointed east, there was no such sheet. The bar his team set was not met. That is not the analyst's verdict, that is the team's own scorecard. Anchorage was supposed to do the same job from the Russian side. A working understanding, not a treaty, an understanding that could be presented in Beijing as a fait accompli. We have spoken to Moscow. Here is the shape of it. That understanding did not solidify. Anchorage produced atmospherics. It did not produce a document. And a summit run on documents reads atmospherics as absence. Kissinger had a working principle from his Beijing era that fits this exact problem. The leverage you bring to a meeting is the leverage that gets used. The leverage you fail to bring is the leverage you are measured against by its absence. Empty hands on a negotiating table are not neutral, they are loud. Arriving with cards is one kind of diplomacy. Arriving with a calendar is a different one. Trump intended the first. He delivered the second. Inside the room, a sentence landed that historians will keep. The American president called China the second superpower of the world. Not the second economy, not the workshop of the West, the second superpower. First time those exact words have been used by a sitting United States president, in a leader-to-leader setting on the record. Recognition in diplomacy is never free. It is not a compliment given because the wine was good. It is a chip placed on the table to keep the table standing while the rest of the meeting goes on. Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of modern Singapore, who built his entire foreign policy on watching how big powers behave around small ones, had a standing principle that applies here. Great powers reveal their real position not by what they declare, but by what they concede. Whoever concedes the larger word in the room is telling you, without meaning to, which side of the table is shorter on the things that matter that morning. Second call. Type 1 if you read that superpower line as a compliment. Type 2 if you read it as a concession. Type 3 if you read it as a setup for the next round. Pick one. Recognition is currency. It spends. Xi made his own move at the same table. He took the Taiwan question, which Chinese leaders had handled for years through deliberate ambiguity, and he gave it edges. He used the word collision. He told the American president on the record that interference on Taiwan would lead to collision between the United States and China. That is the first time a Chinese head of state has used that vocabulary about Taiwan to an American head of state in a leader-to-leader format. Mark the sentence, not the tone, the vocabulary. A red line over Taiwan is not a threat. A red line is a clarification. It tells the other side exactly where bargaining stops and where something else starts. Threats hide their cost. Clarifications publish it. That sentence was for two audiences on the island as much as it was for the one in Washington. To the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, Taiwan's ruling pro-sovereignty side, the message was, do not build your strategy on a guarantee that doesn't exist on paper. To the KMT, the Kuomintang, the opposition with the longer historical relationship with Beijing, the message was, the calendar has moved. You should be acting now, not later. I have watched a clarification like this long before, in a different region. I read it then as posturing. I was wrong by about 18 months. Now I read clarifications the way the room reads them, as the moment ambiguity stops being free. Ambiguity as policy is one option. Clarification as policy is another. Beijing just switched. There is a counter-reading of this trip, and on a serious channel it gets named before it gets dismissed. The counter-reading goes like this. Beijing was a successful reset, not a loss. Recognition flowed both ways. Tariffs were paused, markets calmed, a war was not started. By that frame, the trip ran above par. There is something to that reading. Markets did calm, a pause is real. Not blowing things up is itself a form of competence, and it should be named. But the reading cannot account for the items on the doctrine the administration itself published. No Iran protocol, no Anchorage document, no concession from Beijing on industrial throughput, on the petro-yuan, on the continental footprint. By the scorecard the administration wrote for itself, those are the lines that matter, and those are the lines that stayed blank. By the doctrine the administration published, the trip ran below par. The pause is a real thing, it is not the thing the trip was built to produce. Now lift the summit out of the news cycle and put it on the map it actually belongs to. US-China is not one event. It is a ladder. 5 rungs. Take them in order. Rung 1. Cold War posture. Building containment architecture, alliances, sanctions regimes, technology controls. That rung is closing. Rung 2. Hot peace. Permanent flare-ups in specific theaters, no general war, no general settlement either. That rung is active right now. Rung 3. Proxy conflicts. Third parties fight using each side's tools, money and intelligence. That rung has begun. Rung 4. The threshold of direct collision. The moment two nuclear powers come close enough that the system invents a hotline overnight. We are not there. The blueprint for what it looks like exists. Rung 5. The tent. Either the rivalry is recycled into something manageable or a new global hierarchy is written. Either way, a settlement, not a status quo. Mersheimer's standing point about offensive realism, the school that argues structural rivalry between a rising power and the incumbent is built into the system itself, fits this latter cleanly. Structural rivalry between a rising power and an incumbent doesn't ask permission, it sets the calendar. The leaders inside the rivalry get to choose the speed. They do not get to choose whether the calendar exists. Rung 4 already has a template, and English-speaking audiences know it by name. The Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962, 13 days when Washington and Moscow stood close enough to nuclear use that both governments rewrote their crisis communication systems afterwards. That is what Rung 4 would look like over Taiwan. Not a war, a near miss that forces new architecture. The hotline came from that crisis. Whatever the equivalent for Washington and Beijing will be has not been built yet. Mark the date of this summit. The ladder will be measured against it. Summits don't move the ladder. They timestamp where everyone already is. The silk cord was never delivered in Beijing. It was not pulled tight. It was not handed across the table. It sits where it sat the morning the plane took off, on a desk in Washington, with 2 of its 3 strands still unspun. I have been reading these readouts across multiple summits over the years. The unusual word in this one was superpower, and it was not said by the chair that usually has to say it. The chair that has to say it is the chair short on something the other side wants. That detail tells you the room better than any photograph. By his own doctrine, Trump came up short on the 2 strands that mattered. By his own doctrine, he also did not abandon the doctrine. The cord is on the desk. 3 flows are still the plan. The campaign continues. The trip was a delay, not a reversal. The ladder didn't reset, it clicked. Remember the 2 versions at the top. Version 1, the televised summit. Version 2, the one on the agenda. Now you have evidence for which is which. Decide which version will still be defensible in 6 months and which one will not. Third call. Which rung of the ladder moves next and which capital moves it? Type the rung number and the city. We are coming back to this date. Verifiable check-in, same place. To see which of you read it right. If you got something useful from this conversation, the way to help is to share it with one person who would disagree with you about it. That is how this channel grows. Subscribe if you want the next conversation. Don't subscribe if you don't. Either way, thanks for the time. There is a lot ahead worth giving time to.